Good afternoon, HNBA. Welcome to the afternoon plenary session. My name is Javier Flores. I'm a partner in the Boston office of Dinsmore and Scholl, and it is my pleasure to have served for the Corporate Counsel Conference as the CLE coordinator. Thank you to everyone who submitted CLE proposals, as well as our moderators and panelists. We are really thrilled with the slate of topics we were able to cover during this conference, and hope you all enjoyed it. I also want to thank the Deputy CLE Chairs, Chris Suarez of Steptoe and Johnson, and Marks Calderon, Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida. It is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Frank Jimenez. Frank is truly a leader and is an exceptionally accomplished member of our community. It's actually, Frank, I've introduced people previously, but Frank is particularly difficult because he has 5 or 6 credits that should normally go at the very top of his bio. But starting with the present, Frank is the Executive Vice President and General Counsel at Raytheon Technologies Corporation, serving customers in the commercial aerospace and defense industries. Notably, Frank previously served as the 21st General Counsel of the U.S. Department of the Navy following his nomination by George W. Bush in 2006. And Frank served as Vice President and General Counsel at ITT Corporation. Frank is a fellow first-generation Cuban American who graduated from University of Miami, earned his JD from Yale Law School, earned his MBA from Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and obtained a degree in National Security and Strategic Studies from Naval War College. Before being appointed General Counsel of the Navy, Frank served in the Office of the Secretary of the Defense and as Deputy General Counsel for the U.S. Department of the Defense. Frank will provide an important and inspirational message, placing the immensely difficult last year into context. Thank you, Frank.
Hello, I'm Frank Jimenez, Executive Vice President and General Counsel of Raytheon Technologies. It's my pleasure to address the members of the Hispanic National Bar Association and others attending this year's virtual Corporate Counsel Conference. This year's conference takes place right around the 1-year mark of the global COVID-19 pandemic, and what a year it's been. Quarantines, masks, and social distancing, economic disruption, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, political instability, yet also vaccines, honest conversations, the unburying of things previously buried, light at the end of the tunnel. In several ways, I think this is the perfect time to hold a conference with the theme, Nuestra voz, nuestro poder, our voice, our power. Voices are often found and then strengthened in the midst of adversity, and power is discovered when times are tough. Voices have no effect in a vacuum, and muscles don't grow by pushing against empty air. It's precisely in times like these, filled with challenges and obstacles, when we can make our voices heard most meaningfully and exercise our power to make a lasting impact. Still, there's no denying that these are days filled with greater uncertainty and volatility than usual. So I'd like to focus my remarks on 3 things worth keeping top of mind always, but especially so these days. They are resilience, risk, and readiness. Resilience is important both collectively and individually. Collectively, as Hispanics, we remain among the most statistically underrepresented demographic groups in the legal profession. That's true whether we're talking about law firms, government service, or the corporate in-house world. There are still just too few of us in the profession. It will take many years before we close that gap between our potential and our reality. Throughout those years, we must persevere. We must be resilient in helping one another bridge cultural and economic divides and knocking down barriers to access to legal education and employment opportunities. As corporate counsel, resilience is what our employers expect from us. A few years ago, I had no idea my company would be transformed through a merger of equals with the aerospace businesses of United Technologies, the largest merger in aerospace and defense history. Most, if not all of us, have experienced such unexpected twists and turns by the companies we work for. A divestiture, a merger, a bankruptcy, a senior management change. And our charge throughout it all is to maintain our balance, keep a level head, and calmly help our companies maneuver through the turbulence. In other words, to be resilient. Resilience is critical as well for us as individuals. In my own career, I've jumped and missed a lot. At least 8 times, I missed out on the program I applied to, or my top school choice, or the job I really wanted. Each failure meant taking a different direction than the one I'd planned on. Resilience allowed me to chart my way through the seeming failures and disappointments. If I hadn't been willing to keep jumping, I wouldn't have jumped into my successes. A proper orientation towards risk is essential as well. Risk was modeled for me at an early age by my parents, who came to this country from Cuba through Puerto Rico with no money, no higher education, no English skills, and very little social support structure. Yet they took a calculated risk for the sake of their children. Many of you have similar backgrounds and perspectives. We can't forget this history. Similarly, as corporate counsel, we can't surrender our willingness to take and to advise on smart risks. Our companies can succeed only by taking smart risks, and we can succeed only by helping our companies do so. The same goes for us as individuals. In my career journey, I've changed cities 8 times. I've willingly taken pay cuts 3 times for new jobs. I've switched from a law firm to public service to the corporate world. Each transition entailed risk. A new employer, a new boss, a new industry, a new place to live. Each step built on the last step, but every step was a risk. Carefully calculated risk, not reckless risk, but risk nonetheless. You may end up having to take that leap fewer times than I have. You may not have to move or change job sectors as many times as I have. Like me, you may be able to look back at your failures and be glad they happened because the alternatives turned out better. Or maybe you won't be so fortunate, just as I have no guarantee that my next failure will be one that I end up being happy about. But there's one thing I know for sure, guaranteed. Without risk, you cannot chase your dreams, fulfill your potential, seize opportunities, or leave a lasting mark. It will often seem like the only way not to fail is to avoid risk. But I'm here to tell you that not taking risk is the surest way to fail. Which leads me to readiness. If you had asked me 30 years ago, as I was graduating from law school, to think about the course of my future career and then given me a million chances to predict what that career would be, I would have failed a million times. Most of the time, we just don't know what that next opportunity will be, or when it will come, or who that person will be who will help make it happen. My entry into the corporate world happened in a way I couldn't have expected during a presidential transition when an incoming official from the opposite political party came to my office at the Pentagon, struck up a conversation, and unexpectedly offered to send my resume to a friend of his at an executive search firm. It can be uncomfortable living with the uncertainty that comes with accepting that good careers are often unpredictable and that much of it is just not in our control. But as Ginny Rometty, former chairman and CEO of IBM, once said, growth and comfort never coexist. You've got to be really comfortable with being uncomfortable. And the one thing you can control in both your careers as corporate counsel and in every other facet of your lives is to be ready. I spoke earlier of my failures and disappointments. I would have never realized my successes if I hadn't continued to be ready for them by striving to excel in the moment and become the best attorney, professional, and person I could be. If I hadn't been ready when the unexpected opportunities came, I would have never been general counsel to a governor, chief of staff to the first Cuban American presidential cabinet secretary, the general counsel of the Navy, or a Fortune 100 general counsel. Thank you for this opportunity to talk to you about resilience, risk, and readiness. Best wishes for a productive and successful conference, and more importantly, all my very best to each and every one of you for a productive and successful career. God bless you all.
Maylene Blanco. I am a partner at the New York office of Norton Rose Fulbright, and I am joined with three esteemed colleagues this afternoon. And we are going to be covering the antitrust trends under the Biden administration. But before I do that, and before introducing my panelists, I actually wanted to also thank Javier and especially Frank for those words of wisdom. I think there was a lot there that that keep us inspired, and we're always very, very appreciative of that kind of insights and inspiration. So thank you. So as I said, we're going to be covering the antitrust trends under the Biden administration, even though it's still in its infancy, under 100 days in. But I'm joined today by three members who practice in this area, who are going to join us with some incredible insight. First of our colleagues and first of our panelists, rather, is Mr. Craig Carpenito. Now, if you practice in the Northeast, you know Craig needs little introduction. He is currently a partner at the King and Spalding office in New York. Immediately prior to joining, or rejoining rather, private practice, Craig was the U.S. Attorney for the District of New Jersey, where he oversaw all federal matters, both criminal and civil, in that district, which covers the entire state. In addition, he made some significant organizational changes during his time as U.S. Attorney there. He created the nation's first standalone opioid enforcement unit and the district's first cyber crimes unit, both very hot topics, of course. Craig also expanded the number of federal prosecutors in New Jersey who address healthcare, government fraud, and civil rights investigations and prosecutions. Also joining us this afternoon is Ms. Jamelia Ferris. Jamelia is a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Wilson, Sanosi, Goodrich, and Rosati, where she is a member of the antitrust practice. She regularly appears before the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, representing companies across a range of industries in government antitrust investigations, including mergers and acquisitions and other civil antitrust investigations. Jamelia also provides antitrust counseling on a wide range of business conduct, including joint ventures and pricing and distribution. Last but not least is Mr. Ricardo Solano. Ricardo is a partner in the Friedman Kaplan office. He represents individuals and corporations in healthcare, financial, construction, and other industries in many matters involving fraud, bribery, false claims, violations of the FDA regulations, tax evasion, and money laundering. These matters often involved federal, state, local law enforcement, as well as having parallel civil investigations. Prior to joining Friedman Kaplan, Ricardo served as the first assistant Attorney General of the state of New Jersey. And prior to that, he also served as a AUSA in the District of New Jersey. And with that, I kind of wanted to jump right into our first question, which is a little bit, I think we want to take a moment just to see where we've been and how that's going to impact where we are going in terms of antitrust. And so, Craig, if you can tell us a little bit, we know that administrations obviously take some decisions that have long-term impacts, both with regards to policies, practices, laws that are put in place, as well as funding decisions that really can impact how enforcement occur in a particular space. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of the antitrust enforcement in the coming years?
Sure thing. And first, I'll apologize to everybody. I'm not actually in the middle of a golf course. Apparently, I still don't know what pandemic-friendly WebEx clothing is, but you know, I figured I would come with the casual attitude to this seminar. So Mei-Ling, I think to start, I'd talk a little bit about where we've been the last 4 years as part of the administration. And in particular, for me, the Antitrust Division was an incredible partner, important partner, working in particular with Assistant Attorney General Makin Delrahim, who was actually a fairly aggressive prosecutor in this area, which I think people typically think of Republican administrations as ones that are not going to be as aggressive in the areas of antitrust enforcement. And I think if we look here, what we see is that the outgoing administration actually made antitrust enforcement, in particular, on large technology players and transactions involving big acquisitions, a defining feature. And even in his last speech, his outgoing speech, Makin had actually pointed out that he thought there should be some antitrust policy changes, including establishing a specialized antitrust court and implementing a presumption that for firms with more than 50% market share in a certain market, further acquisitions in that market would be anti-competitive and presumptively unfair. So we start there. What are we coming into? What we know right now, is that we have Judge Garland as our Attorney General. And I think that's a great thing for this practice area and for the country. Many of you may know, some of you may not. Judge Garland actually practiced as an antitrust lawyer at Arnold & Porter early on in his career. And if you watch his testimony, you know that he said it was his first love in law school. So I think we have someone that's going to pay close attention to this area, even though we don't have an appointed AAG in this space yet. The current acting AAG is a guy named Richard Powers, who was the former deputy AAG. I worked very closely with Richard. My biggest foray into the antitrust area was I was appointed by Attorney General Barr to chair the hoarding and price gouging task force in response to the COVID pandemic, which, your average citizen probably isn't thinking, well, antitrust law is where we need some help when a pandemic takes place. But the vehicle that we used, the Defense Production Act, actually had an antitrust component to it in the way that we used it to enforce it. So I worked very closely with Richard. He's also a very aggressive prosecutor in the area and a career employee of the department. So not somebody who's really aligned with Republicans or Democrats. He's somebody who's been there for about 20 years. And I can tell you that he's someone that is going to take a very aggressive stance in the area. What we can glean from the testimony of Judge Garland, because he spent significant time during his testimony talking about antitrust, in particular with Senator Klobuchar, who has some antitrust priorities on her plate and asked some significant questions, is that big tech industry is going to remain a concern for the Department of Justice. Several of the Senate Judiciary Committee members, Senator Klobuchar, Blackburn, Howley, Blumenthal, and Cruz, lobbied for a new DOJ antitrust head to aggressively pursue specific cases against specific companies, in particular, the FTC's lawsuit against Facebook for its acquisition of WhatsApp and Instagram, and questions about the pursuit of Google and other tech companies. I think what we saw from the questioning there is that although the Attorney General obviously would not make a commitment like that during his testimony, I think what we saw was there was definitely an interest in that area. And we all know that the Antitrust Division has the aptitude and capability to really police that area. The final thing I'll say about the administration, for those paying attention, was there was a piece of the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force that was committed to the area of antitrust laws, and the idea of using the Antitrust Division and antitrust laws to factor in social inequities when they evaluate mergers, and to determine whether or not there is a way to assess whether agency policies and actions within the department or within the administration on issues including their evaluation of mergers are creating or exacerbating barriers to full and equal participation by all individuals in any particular industry. This would be a very progressive and very new approach for the antitrust laws, but I think this is something that is going to, at a minimum, be explored and could be actually implemented.
Thank you for that overview, Craig. I think that's really insightful, and I think it's terribly helpful to help us understand where we've been and a little bit of an insight of where we're headed. And with that, I kind of want to move forward from the old administration to the new administration. Jamila, just in the last couple of weeks, I think there's been quite a bit of news regarding some recent nominations in the antitrust area by the Biden administration, including Lina Khan to the FTC and Tim Wu to the National Economic Council. Any thoughts about what those appointments may be suggesting in terms of where the current administration will be headed?
Yeah, so it's pretty interesting to watch the news unfold on these issues because everybody's sort of waiting with bated breath to see who will fill all the slots, not only at the FTC, but also at DOJ. So this was sort of the first signal. And for antitrust observers, something, that was really notable and exciting to chat about. At some level, I think it's not surprising, consistent with what Craig said, this is the direction of antitrust right now. It's very progressive. Lina Khan and Tim Wu have really been on the forefront of those issues as advocates and academics and thought leaders, the both of them. So it's not surprising that two people who are viewed as progressive and viewed as leading the conversation would ultimately end up in the administration. So I think it's both consistent with what you might have expected to see them there. So not really a huge surprise. Lina, of course, was a key author and contributor to the House report on competition in the digital sector, widely respected on the Hill and again among the advocacy and progressive community. So it makes sense that we'd find her there. Of course, the next thing to see is who fills out the commission. Once she is actually nominated and confirmed, who fills out the commission, who's the acting chair, who is the AAG. I think whoever it ends up being, observers will try to place them on the progressive spectrum. How far left are they? How centrist are they? What have they done before? I think I'd caution anybody against making early conclusions. Again, Lina Khan and Tim Wu have been vocal advocates, so it's easier to place them on a spectrum. Other folks may be, bound by their clients and their current work. I think people would be remiss to think that the Biden administration is going to be anything other than very aggressive on antitrust. And folks who choose to serve or are selected to serve are likely to take a consistent philosophy. Where that plays out in terms of specific cases will depend on the cases that come before them. Obviously, the two tech cases are well on their way and they'll be tried out in court. I don't expect that to change. Whether there'll be additional cases will be decided by the administration. And then merger activity will be a place to watch. And that's a space that the agencies can't control what they'll see, but I certainly wouldn't expect them to take a light touch, and I would expect to see that across industries. Probably the biggest challenge for the incoming administration will be resources. We've heard it before. These cases that they're bringing right now are expensive to bring. Economic experts are expensive. They're long cases. This is going to eat up a lot of resources and then of course, merger review. They have to deal with the mergers when they come to them. So that's going to be a space to watch too. I think the agencies are pretty good at figuring out how to bring the cases they want with the resources they have, but undoubtedly they're very stretched thin. So that'll be something to watch as well.
Thanks, Jamila. It's really insightful. So Craig, Ricardo, actually, I kind of want to turn to you with the Department of Justice. I know the positions are still being filled out, as Craig had mentioned earlier. There's still quite a few positions that are vacant and haven't been filled, but obviously Merrick Garland is our Attorney General and he's going to be leading the charge, particularly on the criminal front. How do you see that shaping up in the next couple of years with regards to antitrust cases?
Thanks, Melee. So I think one of the biggest factors would be what Jamila sort of ended with, which is resources, right? So I think, as Craig knows from having run the U.S. Attorney's Office, one of your principal determinations on where you set policy and where you focus on your cases and bring cases is really driven by your resources, both in terms of people, hours, and in terms of monetary resources. And so I think that's a factor that will play into this area regardless of whatever priorities the administrations may have. And sometimes there's factors that play into it that's not necessarily a pro or anti-antitrust position, but you have other priorities on the criminal law front that you want to focus on, that draw resources and that take focus. And so I think those two factors will play a big part of how much increase there actually is in criminal antitrust enforcement. I think if you look back over the years, going back to 2010, there's been a general downward trend. There's some spikes here and there in the number of criminal matters brought by the Antitrust Division. But overall, there's been a general downtrend. I think some of that is driven by the fact that through regulatory enforcement, through civil actions, DOJ has managed to have some successes, and so those may be more sufficient. I think some of it is driven by the type of industries that they're dealing with. Big tech, for example, are cases where you're talking about market power, and you don't necessarily have the more traditional criminal conspiracies around price fixing or market allocation that you might otherwise have. And so those cases might lend themselves more to civil or regulatory enforcement than criminal. So I don't know that there'll be a huge uptick in those criminal cases in criminal antitrust. But like Craig said at the beginning, there are still career folks at the Antitrust Division, and I'm sure that some of those are very aggressive prosecutors who will look for creative ways. And so that's not to suggest that there won't be some increased actions, perhaps some novel theories. I think it'll be more industry by industry. So for example, and we may talk about this later, but with the COVID-19, and I think Craig mentioned this already, with that pandemic, there are issues of whether there's been price gouging and other anti-competitive type activities. I think those, although the pandemic is hopefully, knock on wood, coming to an end, I think you will see criminal cases coming out of that for a while, potentially with both individuals and some distributors having hiked prices or have agreed on set higher prices and had an anti-effect that way. But overall, the last thing I'll say is, Attorney General Garland is sort of widely respected on both sides of the aisle. And one of the reasons is because he tends to be very measured and thorough. And so I think it's hard to read from, Craig mentioned his background in antitrust. He obviously, when he was on the DC circuit as a judge, wrote opinions. I think some go in favor of plaintiffs and more antitrust enforcement. Some go in favor of defendants. So I think it's hard to read. I think he'll, if by his reputation, he's an attorney general that will be sort of measured and careful in how he tries to expand, particularly in the area of criminal law, where there's other sensitivities to it.
Thanks, Ricardo. And Craig, I wanted to follow up with you on some of the things Jamila said earlier with regards to on the civil front and enforcement and regulatory actions that are being taken by the antitrust. Obviously, big tech remains a big focus. Do you see, other than resources, do you see other challenges in terms of some of the novel theories that are being pursued in this industry, just kind of being sort of so relatively new in terms of enforcement and regulatory actions?
Sorry about that. I couldn't get my mic. Mei-Ling, I think that the biggest issue is going to be really getting a true understanding of the players in the landscape and the breadth of their participation and market share. I think it's much more complicated than the traditional areas of antitrust enforcement and oversight, where we've had, I think, easier and more palpable measurables to be able to do an antitrust evaluation on. And then we have really the fact that it's truly global in scope, these social media companies. One of the big issues that we had when I was in the department, and Ricardo will remember this from his time as well, is what we like to call the going dark problem. That a lot of these media companies have these various different platforms where there's an avoidance of detection based upon the technology they use. That has made them extremely popular with foreign entities and foreign players communicate with U.S. participants. When you have that sort of breadth and you have a truly global scope of all of it, I think that complicates the antitrust evaluation and whether or not the various different factors for enforcement can be met and how you really lay out a case.
Thanks, Ricardo. And so, Jamila, Ricardo, I wanted to circle back on sort of something that's sort of been sort of a topic that's been talked about. I think Frank talked about it in his intro, and I think Jamelia and Craig, you both mentioned it. And this idea of social inequity that has grown over the past year from the BLM movement and the desperate impact of the pandemic on particular social groups. And so these are obviously hot topics in the campaign trail too. Do you think the Biden administration will use the antitrust enforcement tools that it has to address some of these issues? And if so, how do you see that playing out in the antitrust arena?
Yeah, so I think we're starting to see it already with the acting chairwoman Slaughter talking about the need to think about racial impact in M&A transactions, something that hasn't traditionally been done. But to take a step back, I think what you're seeing and what I think people like to continue, you have people who are policymakers, enforcers, and thinking about the regulatory environment and that they operate, and recognizing this is a bigger societal problem. And so you, as an enforcer or as a regulator, you take a look, what is my in addressing issues of social inequality and what tools do I have at my and particularly here, where I think there's a recognition that maybe as a general society, we haven't looked at these issues through the right lens or enough or ignored areas of inequality, then it's absolutely right to take a closer look. Now, I think the question is, so how does that play out? I think, one of the things they have signaled, at least the acting chair has signaled, is that we need to start collecting data in merger review to understand what impacts are in, for example, communities of color. That's a fair question to ask. It seems like that's not going to be relevant, perhaps, in transactions. But if you think about, for example, M&A transactions involving healthcare delivery or retail or other things that are very localized, you could examine a localized impact on the community that live there. So I do think you're going to see people ask questions about this. I think, 10 years ago, people were saying, well, should we be thinking about data and the impact of data in antitrust review? Because that, and not to compare issues around racial equality to data collection, but it's sort of a recognition that this is an issue that's in society. I am an enforcer. What role do I have to address this society? And I would fully expect that the people who are selected or remain on as antitrust enforcers will think about what they can do to address these.
Thanks for those thoughts. So I wanted to turn to, I think, something Craig actually also mentioned earlier, and that's the pandemic's impact on antitrust. Usually healthcare companies and particularly big pharma tends to be a huge focus in antitrust, both enforcement and regulatory. And of course, out of the pandemic, the big pharma has come out as a big heroes, right? They've come out as big saviors. Do you think that's going to change how we enforce antitrust cases against big pharma?
So I think that I don't think there's going to be credit in the antitrust space for any of the past obligations that these companies have made. First, I do think that big pharma does deserve a huge debt of gratitude from this country for all that it's done. And the way that it stepped up and how quickly it moved and how it modified its operations, not just pharma, but I think medical supply and device companies. I could tell you because I chaired the task force and worked directly with most companies. Yesterday, I was on the phone with the head of litigation at 3M, who has become a friend. The way 3M stepped up and made all of its information about its product available to the public so that the public could make an informed decision about whether they're being price gouged. The way that so many companies accepted the Defense Production Act and modified their operations to step in and fill the void on various different things that we needed in what was really a wartime effort, just a war against a different type of enemy. All of that being said, and all the gratitude that we owe them, I don't think that any administration is going to apply a generosity factor to an antitrust analysis. But I see Amelia smiling, interested in what she'd say, because I think she agrees.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think we're all grateful that people are getting vaccines already. It's a miracle. I just think that that's sort of just a different question than whether there's either anti-competitive behavior or problematic transactions involving pharmaceutical companies. They're just sort of completely separate and apart. And I do think this will be a very significant area of focus. And like big tech, already they're signaling that they're going to take a new look as opposed to the traditional approach. So just earlier this week, the FTC announced a task force, a multi-jurisdictional task force with the UK and the EC and the DOJ to re-examine how we analyze pharmaceutical mergers, because maybe they, want to take a fresh look and think about them differently, as many of those transactions are typically approved with the divestiture of a discrete product. I think that will be sort of outside the scope of any COVID-related pass. I mean, what you have seen with flexibility in the antitrust laws, particularly early on in the pandemic, was DOJ approving through their business review process a number of collaboration agreements in order to ensure that companies could work together to address issues around distribution and other issues related to the pandemic. So, that certainly has its benefit, but that's sort of, again, just sort of separate and apart from any specific violation of the antitrust laws. And I think drug prices are going to continue to be an area of concern. It's certainly what you might think of as a pocketbook issue, which is resonates across administrations, but particularly now. And if you're worried about income inequality, for example, this is an area where you see a lot of people suffering. So I imagine that the antitrust enforcers are going to take a look and see what it might be that they can do about it.
Yeah. If I could jump in, Mei Ling, I just had one.
Yeah.
So I think both Jamelia and Craig are right, and no one's going to get a pass because they did a lot of good in a certain area. I think where you might see not necessarily a pass, but maybe some delays are in your local, the state AGs and some of the antitrust work that they do. I know we're talking about the federal for the most part, but what you might not want to have is on the front page of your local paper, you suing the largest medical, hospital chain in your state over some antitrust issue when they're the ones servicing the pandemic in that area. And I think that's all for the reason that vaccines, hopefully we're at the back end of this. Probably earlier on, there was more of a hesitation for that when hospitals were being overrun. But I think there'll still be some sensitivity. Again, I don't think you'll get a pass, but I think there'll be some at least awareness of, do we do this now? Do we do this later? Are we sure about this? Where you don't want to be seen as hurting important players in the market, but definitely not a pass.
So it sounds like no get out of jail free card for big pharma in the foreseeable future. And I couldn't agree with that more coming from the white collar angle. So absolutely. So other than, I guess we've talked about big tech and we've also talked about big pharma. Horizon scanning, Jamelia, Craig, anybody, Ricardo, any other industries where you think there's going to be significant activity in the antitrust space?
Yeah, so another area sort of related to tech, I think we'll continue to see activity. There's a lot of innovation in that space, but at the same time, they're big players. So I think the agencies will focus there. Agriculture continues to be an area of concern. I think you might see a lot of consolidation as a result of the pandemic. So those industries that end up consolidating will be an area of focus. But one thing you can't discount is how much you can't anticipate where the activity will be, particularly on the merger front. So in the last year, the agencies challenged 2 deals involving personal razors, like razor blades. No one would have said, a year ago, oh, I bet that's exactly where you're going to have antitrust enforcement. But they were industries that were experiencing disruption by new entrants with innovative distribution models. And so as a result, or at the same time that was happening, large incumbents attempted to acquire them, and then that became an area of focus for the agency. But again, it's like hard to say there's a trend in personal products, but rather that's where the consolidation occurred. So I think at some level it will be unpredictable. But if you were looking at like where could the next area be that is going to have a lot of merger review or activity, I think you'd look at sort of places that are experiencing consolidation as a result of the pandemic. And then the question will be, is the fact that the market has contracted somewhat a reason to let a deal go through that they otherwise might have challenged? I don't know the answer to that because I don't know what the facts would be, but I think you could see stuff there.
I would add, I think we talked enough about it already with the pandemic, but I think one thing that'll be a look back is, especially at the beginning of it, when we had such a shortage in PPE and certain medical equipment like ventilators, there might be a look back to see if there was an over consolidation of the market in those areas where there was too much of consolidation and not enough players in the market and competition to have created more of those products. And I don't pretend to know the answer to that, but that's certainly one question that's going to get asked. I think another area that you're going to see an increase in is just because it happened, there was a new prosecution last month. It's not necessarily specific to any industry, but labor practices and looking at whether employers are colluding to prevent competition among employees being able to move from one employer to another, whether they're colluding to keep wages down. I think, you know, the first criminal prosecution occurred in February and was announced to sort of highlight the fact that some of these things take forever and go over various administrations. I think it was a 4-year investigation. So it wasn't necessarily a new trend, but it was something that the Antitrust Division had been looking to. And I think where it might get an uptick is if you combine it with the idea of the new administration's focus on social justice. Obviously, that's one area where they could look at. They could look at our, you know, corporate employers unfairly suppressing wages by having, you know, agreements to do that. Our corporate employers unfairly limiting employee mobility by enforcing no poach or you know, non-compete agreements. And I think that's a novel area where you might see an uptick in enforcement, and that'll apply obviously to across the industries.
And I think that's you know, turning, we talked a lot about domestic, but I think I want to turn a little bit into the global perspective, because at least from an outsider's point of view, we've seen an uptick in antitrust enforcement in other jurisdictions globally. And, you know, this is sort of the trend. The US tends to be the global cop, and other jurisdictions sort of realize that these are, you know, these enforcement actions tend to be huge money revenue makers for governments, as these settlements tend to be very, very large. So do you, Craig, Jamelia, do you guys foresee that there will be you know, increased multi-jurisdictional actions, or at least more coordination on the global front with regards to antitrust? And do you see any barriers in that regard? Craig, I think you might be on mute.
Sorry about that. So I'll just say in general, Mei-Ling, in the past 20 years, having worked at a federal regulator and the Department of Justice for half of that time, what I've seen is just 20 years in the grand scheme of things is fairly rapid, right? A rapid change in the international regulatory approach to more simulate what we see here in America, certainly in my personal area of expertise, securities and healthcare, right? We've seen the various international regulators step up. That has afforded a lot of additional avenues of cooperation and ease of cooperation between those various different agencies. You know, when I started, I remember Ricardo will tell you as an AUSA, right? You used to hate when you got an MLAT on your copy. I felt like we spent an inordinate amount of time trying to coordinate international requests, whether they were outgoing or incoming. I had a matter in Canada early on where I actually had to file letters rogatory as a regulator. Today, there are MOUs, memorandums of understanding, with virtually every one of the major regulators in these countries, where they have a direct line to our U.S. regulators, where they can freely share information pursuant to those MOUs without the interventions of the courts in this cumbersome process. I think that, to your point, I think there's more of a global reach of, you know, the industries, I think that are impacted by these antitrust laws, and we're going to see more global coordination on that front.
Ricardo, did you have some thoughts to add on that with regards to global enforcement and perhaps some of the barriers that we are seeing that we might see?
Nothing other. Nothing other than commiserating with Carpenito on the fact that yes, it was impossible, and it's amazing how far it's gone. Like I wouldn't go so far as say you'd avoid a prosecution, but you'd think long and hard about it if you had to do an MLAT to get information from a foreign country. And obviously, I've been out of the department for a while, but I see it at the other end on the criminal defense side that that's not the case anymore. You often have, and you've seen it mainly, I'm sure, in your practice as well. You have cases where the evidence is coming from the EU or from Asia or from other countries with rapid speed and not taking 3 or 4 years to get that information. So I think that's right. I think also the nature of the business, and Jamelia could probably talk about this more, but companies are more global. So I think you're going to, by necessity, if you want to bring criminal prosecution, see that. I think some of the barriers have been removed, right? You always have to be sensitive, not just in this area, but in any area where you have global communications with data privacy issues. I think that always creates a barrier to it. There's ways to work around it, obviously, and I think the Department of Justice over the years has continually found ways to improve it, and I don't mean get around it in a way that's sort of improper in any way, just ways to deal with it is what I would say. But that always presents hurdles. And I think the only other area that there might be some complications with the global stuff is global investigations are in the area of cooperation. So this is a difficulty that companies face and that individuals face. So, you have a company or an individual that operates in various markets, and now you're going to go to DOJ in the hopes of getting leniency on an antitrust issue, for example, but you're admitting conduct that might be used by regulators in the EU or in Asia to prosecute you. And so some of that's been better. The Department of Justice has had a long history of having a very detailed leniency program for both entities and individuals in the criminal space. Other countries were more vague, and so entities were hesitant to come in and basically confess to a crime without protections that their conduct might not be prosecuted elsewhere. I think that's changed over the years. I think the European Union overall has improved their cooperation understandings and given more guidance on that. I think there's still other countries. It depends on where the enforcement. I can imagine there's a lot of countries where it's less clear, and so at the end of the day, let's face it. If you have a real problem, you're going to deal with the DOJ and you're going to try to solve it. But your initial presentation, how you come in, there's something to consider. It could be a barrier to typical.
Yeah, I mean, Ricardo, I tend to agree with you. We're definitely seeing a lot more, coordination at the very least with regards to enforcement matters. And I know, at least in some areas in the Department of Justice, foreign prosecutors are being trained in the U.S. because in a lot of foreign jurisdictions, what is an internal investigation is still something in its kind of sort of infancy. And so, really, they're learning a lot from the U.S. Now, on the civil front, Jamelia, what do you see on the global scale? Have you seen taken in actions, and where do you see the activity?
Yeah, so one of the places to really watch on the civil side is the CMA in the United Kingdom. They are incredibly aggressive on merger review. And like I mentioned earlier, there's a task force now focused on the pharmaceutical sector where they'll be working together with the U.S. authorities and the EC to develop approaches to pharmaceutical transactions. So post-Brexit, that's really been one of the active agencies. They're both building up their capabilities. They've had a number of matters in front of them even over the last year. And not only are they, very aggressive, active enforcers, they're increasing their own internal ability and resources to be able to handle, for example, large merger reviews. So that's a space that companies should really watch and understand the competitive dynamics in the UK before they do any transaction, for example, because I really think it's an area that it's a high risk area to have a deal that might have local impact. Certainly, of course, there's 140 antitrust agencies around the world with varying levels of experience and activity, sort of depending on their priorities. We always look out for reviews in China, in the EC, in Germany. But, if something has changed over the last couple of years, it's really in the UK. Again, because they now have their own enforcement authority and are increasingly focused on using it.
And then that goes back to the resource, right? Where people are empowered and where their money is placed, and that's usually where you see the activity. So
Yeah.
So I'm going to give the panelists one final thought, but I just wanted to remind everyone that if you do have a question, please don't be shy to ask it. We are taking questions. I know we only have about 5 minutes left in the panel, but please, if you have a question, put it in the chat box and we will do our best to get to it. But while we wait for those questions to come through, just final thoughts from everybody on just generally speaking, by the Biden administration and antitrust. What are your final thoughts on that? Ricardo, I'll start with you, if you don't mind.
So I'll say something that's I think one of the things, it's nice to have your priorities and what you want to do, and especially on the regulatory front and with the FTC and what they want to do. The Biden administration, like every administration, it still has to deal with the judiciary, right? And so they'll still have to deal with what's coming up. So I think there's a lot of thoughts. I think, as Jamelia started at the beginning saying, the appointments themselves suggest, an aggressive stance on antitrust issues, particularly with respect to big tech. I think they'll get support in, certainly congressionally. There seems to be bipartisan support for different reasons, but there seems to be a uniform consensus that some of the big tech companies of the world got too big in their space and are really producing anti-competitive or markets or anti-competitive practices. So I think there'll be support for the Biden administration, a lot of that. I think they'll have to deal with the judiciary, right? As one of the things we know from the prior administration, one of their legacies, whether you agree with it or not, was they were very successful and very efficient in filling judicial vacancies. And so the judicial philosophies of those judges will be the ones ruling upon some of the actions. And I think the one other sort of hiccup or hurdle that they'll run into, there's a different legislation, or Senator Klobuchar just introduced legislation to relax some of the standards for evaluating or bringing claims under antitrust laws. I think those are things that with 50-50 Senate, you're probably going to have a hard time getting through. And so those are all the realistic challenges that they'll have to deal with. But I think in other areas, like certainly the pandemic stuff, I think in other areas like the big tech stuff, they'll have support certainly from a lot of the players in the market to go after them.
And Jamelia, and I have to apologize before Jamelia. I made a misstatement. The plenary actually goes until 2, so we have plenty of time for questions. So if you do have a question, we have more than enough time to cover it. So please send those in, and we're getting those live. So we'll love to cover those for you. Jamelia, some general thoughts?
Yeah, so I think I don't disagree with anything Ricardo said. I do think there'll be a higher risk tolerance. So I think the agencies will be willing to push boundaries and nonetheless, face the risk of maybe losing in court. As a general matter, we'll see where that plays out and on what specific cases. I don't know what those will be. But I think in general, given sort of the view of antitrust and the shift in thinking, I think that they would be willing to take tough cases that they think they might lose, including because we'll see what that does to a push to change the law. I think, again, we'll see who they appoint, but my expectation is that anybody would be coming in with an eye towards being aggressive on antitrust, and that might mean, like I said, losing some cases, and there might be an appetite for that in a way that might not have been there before, including because, over the last decade, they've had some successes, good case law, good affirmation of some of the policies that the agencies have put in place. So maybe it becomes the time to push the boundaries a little bit. So I think you'll see that. And I think you'll really see a push for resources, and that could have a significant impact as well in the ability of the agencies to do what they want to do in terms of enforcement.
And Craig, some thoughts from your end?
Oftentimes. Am I?
Okay.
Okay. Am I off again? Okay. Sorry. I often tell folks these changes in administrations oftentimes seem like they're going to have a bigger impact than they actually do. I mean, the department has historically maintained many of the same priorities and the same vigor in each of these areas with small minor tweaks along the way. I think there's other areas outside of antitrust where we may see major seismic changes in the administration's approach to enforcement. But on the antitrust front, I'm happy to say that I thought that the prior administration was active in the space. I think they took innovative approaches to things like the pandemic, and I think that the Antitrust Division is set up for success in this next era. And I think we covered today the kind of things we're going to see. The biggest question, I think, is going to be funding and staffing, quite frankly. So I think that's going to be there. I think we're going to see an even larger and more invigorated department, and I expect to see a lot of activity. We're already seeing in New Jersey, in a number of different spaces, increased activity.
And thanks for that. Go ahead.
No, sorry, go ahead. You're right.
No, so I think I was going to turn our focus a little bit. We've been talking a lot about enforcement actions, regulatory actions, and criminal matters as well. Curious to see, we also have a new Congress. Does anybody see any laws on the horizon that perhaps will shape some of this, how it plays out? Anything anybody sees in terms of either actual laws or the way funding decisions are being made?
So I had mentioned that, Senator Klobuchar has a new bill out, or has introduced legislation that would do a couple of things. It would, provide protections for whistleblowers. A lot of these criminal cases are often driven by a whistleblower coming in and speaking to the Department of Justice. It would lessen sort of the standard that you'd have to show for anti-competitive conduct. Currently from substantially lessening anti-competition, from substantially lessening competition to creating a risk of materially lessening competition. So it's a lower standard. And in some contexts, it would sort of flip the burden over for the defendants to prove, or for the merging entities to prove that they would not result in less competition in this merger. As I mentioned earlier, obviously the reality is that when you have a 50-50 Congress, those are subject to filibuster and other things like that. So it's not clear whether or not there'll be widespread support for those. But one thing that will happen is if there's a heightened spotlight put on certain industries or certain conduct in the antitrust space, and we don't expect the big tech congressional investigation to go away, that'll bring out conduct that then the regulators or DOJ may look at that may not have been on the radar screen. And so that's one way that the administration through, I should say, some of the more progressive or aggressive, whatever you want to term them, antitrust folks in the Senate and the Congress can bring to light certain areas that they want to have a focus on. And once they come to light, then there's obviously pressure on the administration and the DOJ side of the house to take some action in that area. And that could result in more enforcement actions.
Thanks, Ricardo. Jamila, Craig, do you guys have any thoughts in terms of any legislation that may be coming down the pike and how might that shape things?
Yeah, I would just echo what Ricardo said. I don't think the Klobuchar bill will be like the last word on that. I think she and others will continue to push for legislation. There's so much activity and interest on the Hill. There's absolutely the challenge of a Congress. There's also some areas of agreement, particularly around big tech, that they might find ways to be more aggressive on particular industries. I think this is going to be a space to watch for the entirety of the next 2 years. I can't see into the crystal ball to know how it's going to play out, but this is not the last conversation one will have about this, and the Klobuchar bill, the introduction of that won't be the last development. I absolutely think that there's the potential for change on that front, and what it'll look like, I guess that part I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have a question, so I'm going to try to read that question. It was mentioned earlier that there would be a focus on social inequities during the merger evaluation. How much of the antitrust focus is based upon large corporations that may not have looked at their impact on society's values? Corporations do try to be good corporate citizens, but the impact to the marketplace may be challenged for various reasons. what role do you see the positive corporate citizenship being taken into account by these regulators?
So it's an interesting question. I think it's sort of consistent. It harkens back to what we were saying about the miracle of the COVID vaccine, right? So in the abstract, that a company has been a good corporate citizen probably doesn't carry a lot of weight when you're looking at a specific, deal or conduct. That's sort of in addition. They happen to be a good corporate citizen on this particular issue, but the regulator is going to care about the impact on competition in a specific market. So I don't actually think that will make much of a difference. It's not going to get you extra credit, I don't think. Certainly you see, good corporate citizen companies having their deal challenged, and it's not to say that, they're always bad actors or anything like that. You're just focused on the particular impact of competition on a particular product. I think the challenge when you're thinking about, I think what the issue on the table with respect to social quality is, well, what is the specific impact on a particular group, particular transaction or conduct? You might, for example, if you start to think about the impact on workers, this is something the antitrust is particularly looked at, but it is something that people are talking about more. You might think about whether it's impacting certain categories of workers more than others. I don't know what that would look like on a particular deal. I think it's a question that people will be asking, and it's just not going to.
And I think that's sort of the important part, right, Jamelia, that the people will be asking that question. So good corporate citizens, nobody knows to what extent the data will play one way or the other. But I think the fact is that as some of these social injustice or inequality issues have come to light, good corporate citizens will be asking those questions. And so even if it doesn't factor into from the regulator's part, although I think Craig mentioned that there is some consideration of that. But even if it didn't, I think there's pressure now on corporations to be better corporate citizens, if you will, and take into account those impacts that they might have on certain communities.
So like I always like to say, when you're across the table from a regulator, you want to be able to say good things about your client. So it always, I think that's a good baseline, but it obviously doesn't give you a pass for any actual misconduct. But I think, I think it's important that companies do the right thing, and that they're good corporate citizens and they're taking these issues into consideration, because when you're across from a regulator, hopefully not, when you're a customer regulator, you have a good story to tell, as opposed to, we're generally doing a bad thing and we're generally not the best corporate citizen either. So that would not be good. Another area that we haven't talked about at all, sort of a huge industry that we've sort of like stayed off our conversation path here, is financial institutions and antitrust. Obviously, there's been, as a result of the impact that pandemic has had on the economy, there's been a huge pump of cash into our economy to sort of sustain it and hopefully get us through this somewhat dark time. Any insights as to antitrust and financial institutions and potentially the impact of the pandemic and sort of some of the recent laws that we've seen pass? It's the stimulus package, if you will. Any insights into those?
Greg, this is your area, but
I haven't really thought about an antitrust impact in the area on the stimulus payments in the financial sector. From the stimulus payment perspective, I think where you see sort of an implicit impact of the antitrust laws is the regulations that were put in place on the aggregation of subsidiaries to be aggregated together for the total entity level measurements on whether or not PPP and other pandemic-related, stimulus packages were available to these companies. I think we will see in the coming year a number of prosecutions in the stimulus space for larger entities. I'm not talking about the big ultra large corporations, the blue chip companies in the country, but I think there are companies out there and industries in which there were more susceptible to PPP fraud in the aggregation of various different related entities, failing to acknowledge the interplay and the corporate relationships there when applying for stimulus relief. So I think that's probably where I would say I see an interaction on the corporate level, but in the financial services industry, to be frank, I haven't really seen a particular area that I'm thinking about.
So outside of the criminal context, on the civil side, it's interestingly at the end of the Trump administration, they reorganized the civil sections. So the civil sections at DOJ are organized by industry, and those sections review conduct and mergers in their state. And they reorganized the sections around the financial services section that used to be split up in lots of different sections. So now there's one financial services and financial technology section. And that I think will be an area of focus in the sense of, again, civil activity. And on the merger front, we saw the agency last year challenge Visa's acquisition of that as a startup. So I think you'll see there's a lot of innovation happening in the financial technology sector, apart from COVID, just in general, although maybe COVID had even more. And much like the focus on big tech, I think those industries are interesting. They get right to the heart of what agencies have been concerned about. That is, and as did Visa, an acquisition by a large incumbent of a small innovator that was rough. And so I think you could see that on the financial services side. Again, just because we all know from our daily lives how much innovation is happening in the way we engage with the financial sector. So I think you can continue to see that. Again, I don't know where that will come from. And it's outside of the criminal context that Rick was talking about, but something else to watch in an industry that will be of interest.
That's really interesting, Jamila, because obviously it sounds like, we all know the lines between a financial service or any other type of service and technology is really being blurred. And so how are we dealing with those blurred lines, kind of trying to move away from, I was trying to move away from the topic of big tech, but really kind of coming full circle is that it seems like tech is really going to be the area where we're going to see a lot of that activity. And so, as those lines get blurred, what adjustments the administration is going to be making, if any. I think this goes as well back to the issue of, Lisa Khan and Tim Wu being the nominees. They're really focused in those areas and they bring with them a breadth of knowledge. Any other things that you guys see that really are coming onto the Biden administration in terms of knowledge or resources that you think the regulators and enforcers are really going to be able to use to leverage antitrust actions in the future?
So I don't know if this is exactly what you're referring to, but for example, one thing that's going to happen, I think, which naturally happens as everyone's reading this and everybody's reading the idea that there's going to be an uptick, and folks in the market, Jamelia mentioned it at the beginning, are obviously paying attention to who the picks are and are they very aggressive. Sort of in the criminal world, but even in any world where you deal with regulators, you might see an uptick in folks coming in earlier and trying to get ahead of the wave and coming in if they have some serious issues, doing introspective reviews if they have some serious issues, coming back and self-disclosing. And I think you could see an uptick in that. So, and it's hard to know what those areas are because we don't know what the wrongdoing is that's happening out there. But simply having a panel like this and having all the headlines that there is going to be an uptick in enforcement was sort of self-fulfilling in a way. It'll start to create people to maybe be more conscious of it. So in the financial industry, you might be more conscious of it and start to figure out, what concerns you should have. Certainly in the healthcare space, you should continue to have what concerns you might have about acquisitions you're making, even if they're not regulating you, or even if the regulators are not looking at you actively. And because I mentioned earlier in the antitrust space in particular, and this has been around forever, but on the criminal side of the house, there's a very detailed leniency program that, not surprisingly, starts off with a company coming in early and first. But one of the things they can do is sort of in the antitrust space that's a little unique than any other areas, you could even lay down a marker before you even know exactly what your conduct is. So you can say, I have some suspicion, we don't know what it is, but we want to make sure we have our first foot in the door before we can even tell you that we did something wrong, that we definitely did X or Y wrong. And you come in really early and you sort of protect yourself from a criminal prosecution down the road. I think you can see some uptick in that as if based on the appointments made, based on the sort of the messaging coming out from the administration, you can see an uptick in anybody that's in this market, specifically, companies dealing with PPEs, dealing with coronavirus treatment drugs, where they know they're looking at your drug prices to see if, downstream distributions, if you were increasing the pricing or forcing a certain higher price for the product, things like that. You might get those entities to start really doing a deep dive, working with, outside counsel or the internal, and making a decision about, do we come forward now before sort of it's too late?
Self-disclosure is always a big topic when we talk about regulations and enforcement action. So I think that's really interesting insight, Ricardo. Coming back to what seems to be the running theme here, we do have another question from participants, and the question is around the idea of data monopoly and how that concept may play into antitrust concerns, not just in big tech, but how it interplays with finance, health, and pharma, retail, and so on. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. My thought on that is that certainly is going to be, an area of focus, right? Because it plays into a lot of these other areas of priorities, social injustice in a way, protecting consumers. And even though this is a little bit outside the antitrust space, just a general sense that people are fed up with the idea that their data is being collected in ways and used in ways that they didn't anticipate. And obviously you have, Apple in the way that they track customer data, and Amazon in the way that they can see selling transactions and what people are buying. And I think that will naturally, not just in the big tech space, but in other areas, will lead to sort of a focus by regulators to the extent that, that they can bring antitrust enforcement actions, or at least inquiries into those areas.
And on that front, I mean, you also have the folks that you voluntarily give data to. I mean, one of the big discussions that's going on right now are things like 23andMe. And what is actually happening with the data that they collect from the saliva samples that you send in. Because we all know that when we have our phones out, right, oftentimes what we're doing is we're clicking through buttons and disclosures to get to the ultimate questions because we're in a rush, we're a very fast moving society, and we want to get, immediate gratification on a lot of things. It's just check, 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 check. I'm not going to read this 4-paragraph disclosure. Well, if you dig into those disclosures, what you'll see is that you're giving a lot of rights over to these companies to share that data. And there's a debate going on about corporate responsibility in that space right now, and whether or not there should be more transparency about the use of that data. I think that, this is something that over the next 5 to 10 years is going to be a significant conversation about, the collaborations that are going on that are not necessarily front of mind when we enter into these agreements.
And thank you, Craig. I think that's, and maybe venturing a little bit outside of the antitrust space, but I think there was some news just recently about how Apple is going to be interacting with some of the folks that they have on the apps, on their app store, and what they're doing and what knowledge they have with regards to, or rather what permissions are being given and what they're telling their own customers about what they're doing with their data and tracking their data. So I think that's really interesting and definitely an area to watch and see whether there is going to be some interaction there with antitrust as well. So I think we've reached sort of just a slight, almost at the end. I'd like to leave it with a final thought from our panelists before we wrap up for the afternoon. Jamelia, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, it's just such an exciting time to be in antitrust. I remember, when I started, I was excited to be an antitrust lawyer. It certainly wasn't top of the fold in terms of the focus, and it certainly wasn't high up on the political discourse. So it's a really exciting time to be in the space. because I think you're going to see a real evolution. And I think what's also remarkable is that it almost happened in such a short period of time. If you look at, Lena Khan's article, which is now kind of on the forefront of the conversation, it wasn't really that long ago. It was published, and it sort of changed the entire dialogue around antitrust in such a short period of time, or the Warren Sanders unity proposal. Those things were quite different at the time, but not that long ago. And yet now I think you're really seeing a shift. I don't think you see that in many areas of law, that kind of quick change in terms of perspective. Maybe it's just the time that we're in. But, it's a fun time to be practicing in the space.
I mean, Jamila, I have to agree with you. If you read a little bit about Lena Khan, you see how quickly she's risen. She started, it's amazing, right? Her article that really kind of brought her to the forefront was in law school. And that was less than 7 years ago. And now she's, sitting on this high level, commission, which is quite amazing. So kind of makes you feel a little bit under accomplished, but we'll leave that for another time. Yeah. Yes. So Ricardo, any final thoughts from you?
No, I think I echo a lot what Jamila said. It's obviously, it is an exciting time. I think as you see I don't want to say the law has been around forever, right? So this is not, unless they pass new legislation, a lot of these laws, especially in the antitrust space, have been around for decades. But it's innovative approaches, either by theories or to new industries. So I think, for example, I mentioned earlier, the focus on labor practices, which is something certainly new in the space. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out, whether or not they can use it to drive, to reduce or lessen the social inequities that we talked about. So whether or not they're going to start forcing companies to think about, or merging companies to think about the impact it'll have on those issues like racial inequalities. That's obviously something exciting that may happen. And then obviously it's hard to not talk about the big tech because, Facebook was, in particular, their acquisition of Instagram, and they play such a major part in everyday life that it's going to be interesting to see what the outcomes are of those investigations and where they go. And some, there's not uniform. There's a lot of individuals on both sides of the aisle, a lot of individuals across different industries that are critical of Facebook and are on the same page, and they're sort of that they think they got too big. But it's not a lot of folks disagree, and they think it's sort of more of a freedom of expression view. And so it'll be interesting to see how those play out over the next months and years.
Yeah, Facebook tends to be one of those things we kind of want to do without it, but we realize we can't. So I think it's around to stay. So interesting to see how Congress is going to deal with it, and how enforcement and the regulatory space is going to continue to deal with it for sure. Craig, we'll leave the final word to you on our panel because you're our top former top enforcer. So what are your general thoughts and closing thoughts on this topic?
I'm excited to see an antitrust division that is not just reinvigorated, but I'm going to take into account some things that I would call sort of like the soft factors in an antitrust analysis. And that's really the impact on community and the factors we talked about in the social justice areas. I think it's a good thing. I think it's necessary, and I think it's real. It's a big project. It's a hard measurable. I'm proud that they are trying to formulate a way to do so. And I know that we've had many of these sort of task force formed in the past that can take some time to get up to speed. I'm hoping that they come up with a solution pretty quickly. And there's not a long lag between sort of the idea and the integration.
And thank you. And I think that's a nice way to end, because I think these soft factors that you mentioned is definitely something that I think we see in the tone of the Biden administration. So I think that's sort of, it definitely, I think, in my opinion, the Biden administration is definitely going to be focused on some of those issues. It's definitely, it's impacted our life so deeply, so quickly that I think it'd be a sort of an injustice, if you will, to sort of ignore those factors moving forward in any space of government. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. I hope you enjoyed our conversation and found it insightful and helpful. And thank you. Hopefully we'll see you all in person at the next conference. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks for everything. Thanks for hosting, Mailing.
Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon. That was a fantastic job. Mei-Ling, Craig, Ricardo, Jamilia, thank you for a wonderful, thoughtful, and insightful discussion. You guys bring a wealth of experience to the table, and we really appreciate the time that you shared with the HNBA membership on your thoughts and perspectives on what would be happening under the Biden administration with respect to antitrust issues. Folks, we have a great afternoon in store. We have a partner showcase networking that starts at 2 o'clock. We have 4 wonderful CLEs that start at 2:30 this afternoon. We've got artificial intelligence in the healthcare industry, e-discovery in arbitration versus court, COVID-19 employment claims, and then we are discussing careers and regulatory compliance. So please make sure to see if you can make one of those 4 great CLEs. At 4 o'clock, the Young Lawyers Division and the Law Students Division are having a diverse recruiting meet and greet happy hour. It'll be sponsored by the U.S. Navy JAG Corps, so please join us for that as well. And then at 5:45, we have a corporate counsel happy hour. We're going to have breakout sessions, so it'll be a really good time for you to have a meet and greet with people, to get to see old friends, make new friends in the virtual world that we have. And of course, this evening at 6:30, we've got our welcome reception, the Top Lawyers Under 40 Awards. We hope you will all make it. Thank you very much. And again, thank you to our wonderful plenary panelists for the insightful discussion on antitrust issues.